It's my privilege and pleasure to be able to be your host for this evening's session with Professor Guy Claxton. Many of you will know Guy, and I'll introduce him in a moment, but just to set the scene, tonight's webinar is being brought to you courtesy of the Aotearoa Educators Collective. And if you want to know more about that, there's an opportunity to find out probably at the end, or in response, you'll find the details in the emails that you had to get you on here. But that's a collective of educators from across New Zealand who are, like yourselves, wishing to learn and experience more about how we can improve what we're doing in the education, or transform what we're doing in education, based on the very best of the knowledge and experience that we can share with each other. As we begin and acknowledging Aotearoa where we are, I just want to start us with a karakia that just speaks of how out of confusion we can bring a sense of understanding and enlightenment. It'll be familiar to some of my old core colleagues, so will you join me? Unihia te pō whirimarama, tamakia te au whatu tangata, tāta ki runga, tātai ki raro, tātai ahurau, homie, huie, tai kie. And so with that, it's my pleasure to introduce what has been said to me as an all-round learning legend, Professor Guy Claxton. You see there from University of Bristol, and he was listing off to me earlier tonight a number of the other emeritus professorships and associations he has. Not an unfamiliar person to many people in New Zealand. In fact, his love affair with New Zealand goes right back to 1986, when he participated in the science education unit at the Waikato University, he tells me. And since then, he has visited here many times. I've heard him a number of those occasions. And I've also, like I'm sure many of you have, read many of his books. The one I've got on my desk at the moment, which I'll put a plug in for, is called The Future of Teaching and the Myths That Hold It Back. And I can't recommend that enough, really. There's some very bold and provocative thinking in that. And for those who are kind of future focused, there's a new book on the line coming out early next year called Bodies of Learning: How Embodiment Science Transforms Education. Love that title too. So, Guy, I'm looking forward to what you have to say. You'll notice on the slide this what science of learning, and you'll notice perhaps in the invitation you had, there was a bolder title for this talk called The Corruption of Science and the Nature of Learning, which is very appropriate at the moment, given the emphasis that we have in New Zealand on the science of learning. And I think the interest in tonight's webinar, Guy, reflects kind of the growing interest there is to more deeply understand what sits behind all of this. What is it that we really need to be taking notice of? And how can we respond when perhaps the things that we're being asked to do don't necessarily align with the things that we value or think are important? So, Guy, I'll hand over to you to begin the session. Just one thing, though, if I might, there's a Q&A button at the bottom. If you have a question that you would like passed on to Guy, please use the Q&A button. And if you just feel like you'd like to have an ongoing chat with others in the room, or voice some sort of response to what you're hearing, then use the chat button. But the Q&A is what we'll be looking at for questions that you'd like to be transferred directly to Guy. So, Guy, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Derek. I hope you can all hear me loud and clear. Tēnā koutou katoa to all of you. It's very nice to be reconnected with education in Aotearoa, New Zealand. As Derek said, I've been a increasingly part Kiwi for, I don't know, 30 or 40 years. And it always concerns me that you try and resist the temptation to repeat the mistakes that we've been making in the UK. So I'm really pleased to be invited to come and talk to this group, particularly in the current political and educational context. There's always been a kind of long-running tension, sometimes even battle, you might say, about the nature, the fundamental nature and purpose of education, a long-running dispute between, you can frame it in different ways, traditionalists and progressives, people who prefer to focus on the intellectual and the selective aspect of education rather than on the holistic and inclusive aspect of education. And the trade winds have been going backwards and forwards along that spectrum for certainly as long as I've been living and working in education, usually with the kind of inevitability of some kind of pendulum shifting backwards and forwards. But recently, that balance has been shifted by the claim by those of a more traditional persuasion or preference that their position is somehow mandated or legitimated by discoveries in cognitive science, or what's called these days the learning sciences. And if that's true, then it's like a job over. The claim is that certain fundamental characteristics of the young person's mind have been irrefutably and unalteringly discovered by scientists, and that these fundamental truths about children's minds mandate or require basically a rather didactic approach to teaching. We'll come back to this more at the end, but an approach to teaching which sees having children explore as a waste of time at best, and actually damaging, particularly to lower socioeconomic children at worst. And that if this thinking is applied across the board, it will perpetuate a view of education which says basically education is a competitive game in which a proportion of the young population will come out as winners and a sizable proportion will come out as losers of that particular game. That more intellectual, more didactic kind of teaching is the only game of worth in town. Now, if it's true that that's mandated by the science, then this really is a game changer. So we need to be very secure in our knowledge that the science is being used accurately and comprehensively. And that's what I want to explore a little bit with you this evening. So there are just a number of different thoughts and aspects that I'd like to kind of raise with you. There's a handout which I think may be available to you, which is very wordy, I'm afraid, as PowerPoints go, but deliberately designed so that if it will be useful to you to remember some of these points and definitions and ways of putting things in your own discussions, both locally and nationally, hopefully that will give you some kind of support. So the first question is there such a thing as the science of learning? And I'm a retired professor of the learning sciences. I was professor of the learning sciences at the University of Bristol and then subsequently at the University of Winchester. So I know a little bit about whereof I speak. And we have always called ourselves professors or academics of the learning sciences, plural, in recognition of the fact that there is no one agreed solid core of data or theory which is to be universally accepted. This slide just gives you a list of some of the contributory disciplines: neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, affective neuroscience, the wonderful opening up of science about how important emotion and feeling are in the education process and very fundamental to the nature of learning itself. Social neuroscience, in the very importance. What this science is showing really is that the things to do with feelings and to do with relationships are not kind of romantic, nice to haves in education. They are psychologically at the core, at the heart of education, at the heart of the way we should be thinking about learning. Sociocultural psychology, the study of different cultures' approaches to education and learning, cultural anthropology, developmental psychology, embodied cognition, my own particular favorite at the moment. The book that Derek was kind enough to mention, coming out next year, is all about how we misunderstand ourselves if we think of the mind as something separate from and superior to what's going on in our bodies. And of course, many cultures, I'm in no position to pontificate about this, but I suspect perhaps in Maori and Pacifica cultures, that understanding that we need to think of ourselves as body minds rather than minds ferried around by a body, which is not itself part of the intelligent process, is something that we really need to acknowledge in education. Evolutionary psychology, information processing psychology, which takes a model of the human mind as being like a digital computer, and instructional psychology. I put the slide like this in order to indicate that information processing psychology and instructional psychology are two contributory streams to what we think of as the learning sciences, rather than the whole, the be all and the end all. So we run into trouble if we convince ourselves that there is such a thing as the science of learning. It's a British academic, a man called Ben Goldacre, wrote a book a little while ago with the clumsy but I think very nice title, I think you'll find it's a little more complicated than that. He was talking about all kinds of bad science. And I think if we're going to use the science well, we have to admit, understand, and embrace its multiplicity and its complexity. Secondly, do the findings that are claimed for the psychology, for the science of learning, apply to all kinds of learning? Learning comes in many different shapes and sizes. So we should not just be talking about the sciences of learning, but the sciences of learnings. Learning to love, learning to form an identity, learning to learn, learning to develop attitudes, values, and interests. The kind of learning that form the basis, the template for an apprenticeship as opposed to a studentship. The kind of learning that goes on in drama, in what we call in the UK design technology, actually making, fixing, building things with your hands, physical education. Does one simple psychological understanding apply equally to all of these kinds of things? What may be a relevant way of thinking about learning as people struggle with the problem of quadratic equations? Down the corridor in any secondary school, you might find quite a different model and attitude and aspect of learning, alive and well and entirely functional in a deep understanding of the classic graphic novel called Mouse, for example, which I've watched wonderful lessons, particularly in Australia, of teaching about that. A template that is fitting and possibly useful in the context, let's say, of maths and science, may be much less fitting and much less useful in the context of other kinds of learning. So the takeaway from this is that the sciences of learnings range much more broadly than teaching maths and science for exams. Sometimes people have fallen into the trap of thinking what's relevant and apposite in the context of maths and science somehow or other acts without really thinking it through as a legitimate template for everything that goes on in schools and education. And I think that's not a scientific conclusion that we should draw. This slide is just a reminder that when we talk about science, the origin of the word scientia just means knowledge, understanding. So the sciences of learning are developing knowledge and understanding which come in many different forms, as well as there being many different forms of learning. skill, wisdom, empathy, a whole variety of different things. And all of these bring with them, all of these different disciplines bring with them different research methodologies. So binary experimental contests, the kind of things that I was brought up, trained as an experimental psychologist. So I'm immersed in the form of methodology which is forced on us by a kind of psychology that says the only data that is worth having is where we get two groups which differ only in one small aspect, and we give them the same thing to do. And if group A turns out to do better than group B, then we can infer a strong causal relationship between that one differing aspect. It's often taken to be the royal standard, the gold standard of educational research. But of course, as I say, there are many other kinds of educational research, and that gold standard often doesn't apply in classrooms. Classrooms are, excuse me, highly complex systems at work, and systems thinking is not amenable to that kind of simple cause and effect thinking and that kind of simple cause and effect methodology. So if we're going to be good scientists, we have to admit a much wider range of methodology than trying to pit a crude stereotype, for example, of something that you might call discovery learning or pure discovery learning against something called didactic teaching or direct instruction or something like that, and measuring their effects only by their effects on school results is not a comprehensive or fair-minded way of thinking about educational research. I also wanted to note here that as a general way of thinking about it, about learning, my way of thinking about it now, which although I've talked about many different kinds of learning, which seems to embrace all of them, I think of it as that which transforms experience into lasting changes to competence, character, and comprehension. All of those three things, if I have time, I'll talk a little bit more about these later on, are in play in education. What do we want kids to be able to do as a result of those 12 or 13 long years? I think that's a more fundamental question than what do we want them to know? What do we want them to be able to do? What equips them to live competently? And also, as many countries around the world are grappling with, a very important aspect of what goes on in the lengthy process of schooling is the shaping of interests, values, and characteristics. So there's a lot of international research in the learning sciences around the notion of what aspects of character support learning and to what extent are those aspects of character themselves influenced for good or ill by different kinds of classrooms. Memory, I'm just writing a section for the new book about memory at the moment. Memory is the embodiment of learning, if you like. It's the way experience leaves its mark on the physical processing apparatus of the human being, the human mind. If we have time, we can unpack that. So that's a way of thinking about the nature of learning and the nature of memory, which does not invite us to leap prematurely to the idea that learning is all about committing knowledge to memory and that memory is like a warehouse somewhere inside the brain. Those are metaphors or understandings which may or may not be helpful. So it's important to draw back to definitions, to ways of thinking about learning and memory and education, which are not, as it were, where we don't preempt our understanding and our thinking by adopting prematurely metaphors which may not be as useful as we want them to be. One of the problems here is not our dear old friend Jean Piaget, I don't think, but the way in which Jean Piaget's research has been misunderstood by educators. This is another driving misconception. Piaget styled himself as a genetic epistemologist, not a developmental psychologist. He was interested particularly in the way rationality and scientific knowledge and thinking in particular, the way in which they came into being. So his theory of stages is like an epistemological theory, not a psychological theory. When you look at things from a psychological point of view, things look rather different from the way in which Piaget has been used to legitimate an approach to education. People think that Piaget has discovered that there are separate phases that children go through as they grow up, and they become increasingly valid and increasingly viable as children move through the sensory motor phase to pre-operational, to concrete operational, to formal operations, and that somehow formal operations are seen as the highest form of intelligence, and that, as it were, we climb the ladder from these different ways of thinking and knowing. So, sort of with a sigh of relief, we can kick the ladder away behind us and not be bothered about the sensory motor or the imaginative any longer. It's a bit like that thing in the Bible about when I was a child, I thought as a child, I saw as a child, I imagined as a child, but now I no longer see through a glass darkly. Now I've graduated into a better form of thinking. What the science of learning is teaching us, however, is that the earlier forms of learning continue to be vital and continue to develop throughout the whole of the lifespan. You wouldn't be able to learn your way around a new school and a new job without your sensory motor intelligence. You wouldn't be able to be imaginative without concrete operations, without the use of imagination in your own mind. So we need to be, again, inquisitive, suspicious about some of the underlying understandings that may have driven us in the direction of a more intellectually focused education, rather than one that embraces all aspects of learning and all aspects of development. Let me introduce you. Yeah.
Sorry, Guy,
Derek,
just before you start the real life learning scientist, there's been quite a bit of conversation in the background and a question that came through in regard to what you just said that I think would be useful to comment on. It says, Guy seems to be suggesting, this is going back to an earlier slide, that maths and science may perhaps have a limited range of pedagogies than other disciplines, saying something like this is not necessarily appropriate to apply in other areas. And I was just asking you for clarification. Is that the right interpretation, I guess?
I think it's an open question as to what extent models or theories or images of learning, which may be appropriate in a year 5 or year 6 classroom where students are learning how to do long division or how to amalgamate the use of decimals with an understanding of long division. It's an open question, and I think it's one that we need to treat carefully as to whether that model of education, which may be useful, helpful, valid, and applicable in the context of those kinds of learnings, whether that is also somehow the template that we should aspire to in a drama workshop or in a rugby coaching session. I don't think it does. I think the evidence is that we may need to develop much more customized views of learning, which are appropriate to different learning contexts. And we'll come to this later on, Derek, different kind of learning outcomes. Depending, the kind of pedagogy that we want will depend critically on the kinds of outcomes that we value for children, and that's another important part of this puzzle. I hope will that do for now?
I think that's answered it well. Thanks. Sorry for the interruption.
Okay, great. No, not at all. Please keep them coming. So I wanted to introduce you to some real life learning scientists that may not fit the mold that some people would have you believe. So meet Roger Schank. Roger Schank passed away a year or two ago, but he was the inventor of the phrase the learning sciences. He was a cognitive psychologist. professor at Yale, professor of psychology and artificial intelligence, actually, at Yale University, the founder of the first Institute for the Learning Sciences in the USA, co-founder of the Journal of Cognitive Science. It doesn't get much more respectable than that, does it? I put a copy of his photo here, but also a book that should be required reading for everybody who aspires to speak on behalf of the learning sciences. It's called Teaching Minds. And it will give you a very different perspective on what the science, the learning sciences have to say about the nature of learning. I've just a few little quotes from Roger, just peeled these off the internet. Learning is about failure and recovery from failure. Learning is not about shallow glide paths of learning that protect children from the experience of failure. He's saying something very different from that. Learning happens when someone wants to learn, not when someone wants to teach. Is it true that the learning sciences say, as I believe has been thoroughly well evidenced, that curiosity is the engine of learning, that we neglect to engage students' curiosity to our peril? It's like sitting in your car and trying to get it to go somewhere without turning the engine on or without engaging the clutch or the automatic transition. The motive force for learning is curiosity, yet many busy teachers think that somehow trying to engage what they're teaching with children's own questions is either a romantic something that we can well do without, or something a nice to have that we're so much under pressure to cover the curriculum that we can neglect it. It's a time not well spent. Here's a quote from one of Shank's books. A properly designed school system needs to focus on cognitive abilities, not cognitive subjects, not scholarly subjects. If we allow students to choose what areas of knowledge they would like to focus on while learning those skills, they would be attentive and interested. So what he's raising, what he's saying, and his book, Teaching Minds, is a long exploration of this, is that the learning sciences open up the possibility that we are not teaching maths, we're training minds, not just in primary school, not just in nursery school, not just in kindergarten, but way up into senior school, high school, year 12, physics and chemistry. We are in the process of shaping cognitive and affective and social processes and attitudes, which is very different from some of the ideas that are being spread around about the learning sciences. So that's the late Professor Shank. Lauren Resnick, director of the University of Pittsburgh Learning and Development Research Center, past president of the American Educational Research Association, pretty good, talks about the nature of transfer. These are just some of the issues which complexify, which make more complicated our understanding of the learning sciences, and which should give us a long pause about trying to boil the messages of the learning sciences down into something simple and prescriptive. Lauren Resnick says, as long as school focuses mainly on individual forms of competence, on tool-free performance, and on decontextualized skills, educating people to be good learners in school settings alone may not be sufficient to help them become strong out-of-school learners. Well, is that what we want? Is that what we're aiming for? Are we aiming for people who do well in their terminal exams, but may not be very powerful real-life learners? Is that our goal of teaching? Or are we aiming beyond that? Are we aiming for people who would lead lives that are rational, exploratory, inquisitive, curious, adventurous? If we want that, then the conventional or traditional apparatus of school, we'll come back to evidencing this again, may not be the kinds of pedagogies that we would wish to mandate in school. Professor Mary Helen Imordino Yang is a huge presence in the learning sciences at the moment, mentored by both Howard Gardner and Antonio Damasio, extremely well respected pedigree, who's done a lot of this. Is her recent book, a collection of her papers called Emotions, Learning and the Brain. If we want to understand the brain properly, we cannot understand it as merely a cognitive organ. We have to understand it as an emotional organ as well. This is her talking about the nature of the importance of relevance as from some of her more recent studies, which are very thought-provoking. It's fairly obvious that there's a fundamental mismatch between secondary education and the way kids learn. Bold statement. In school, we want kids to start with the small building blocks, to learn the little pieces and start to put those together. But that's not how the human mind grows. It grows by engaging with deep, powerful ideas and then working backwards to inform the meaning you're making. You start with what matters to you. That's not something sentimental or progressive. It's a fundamental truth about the nature of learning. Supporting young people to engage with the complexities of their moral and social lives is what is deeply, deeply motivating, and it is what grows their brains. She's been doing some fascinating studies in the US recently, showing videos of young people engaging with complex real-life issues. Here's Malala from Pakistan, who you will be familiar with as an icon of what young people could do, or Greta Thunberg or whatever else. And then having very deep conversations with these kids in America about how they reacted to that, what that means, what that story means to them, what sense they make of it, how it touches or engages or doesn't engage with their own lives. She puts them in a brain scanner, looks at various different aspects of their brain function, brings them back 2 years later, and the students who have had this experience of legitimating, encouraging a deep inquiry into that which matters to them show significantly greater brain growth in important areas of their learning brains and their learning cortexes. So we have hard biological neuroscientific data for particular approaches to education. David Perkins, one of my personal gurus, co-founder of Project Zero, wonderful book of his, again, one that everybody who claims to speak on behalf of the learning sciences should have read inside out and annotated. I could show you my copy, which is pretty much falling to bits from the amount of use that it's had. Talking about the importance of collaboration, the social side of learning. Hardly anything we do is done solo, he says. No matter whether you're an athlete, a business person, a scientist, a trash collector, or a clerk, you're almost always coordinating with other people in a complex way. Human endeavor is deeply and intrinsically collective. Oh, except in school. So what's the challenge there for us? The collective challenge from these icons of the learning sciences. Are we content with a traditional business as usual approach, or are the learning sciences throwing down deep and important and well-founded challenges to the way we think about education and the way we operate in our classrooms, to the forms of pedagogy that we value? So it's just giving you some thoughts and some ideas, ammunition, if we want to use a rather bellicose model language, for talking accurately and broadly about what the learning sciences have to say to us, what challenges they give to us, and being very suspicious about any simple attempts to say the science tells us that we should do this. It's what we used to call, back in the old days, a school child error, to try and claim that you can deduce an ought from an is. Science tells us what is, but you cannot, without having a conversation about values, move from that is to the ought, to how we ought to be teaching. You cannot legitimately draw a straight line from the sciences of learning to the practices of education without also weaving into that a conversation about ethics, morals, the demands of society, the nature of children's brains and understandings. It's not intelligent to try and draw such direct conclusions. So one of the kind of bugbears of what we've been talking about is the what's the word I'm looking for? Disparaging use of the concept of constructivism. And it's presented as if it was an ideology. Some people still use those. Oh, that's an outmoded constructivist way of thinking about learning. As if constructivism was a kind of optional ideology like creationism, something that one could just adopt without regard to anything serious. But I think it's fairly well established now that what I tend not to use the word constructivism because it's emotive. It's an empirically based understanding of how and why human beings are built to learn, which is about as secure as the theory of evolution, I think. Here's a couple of examples of seminal texts, accessible texts in the learning sciences. Alison Gopnik's The Gardener and the Carpenter, Stash de Haynes' How We Learn, are all heading in this direction. Some basic understandings, just to summarize some of the things that we've been saying. We learn in order to expand competence and control. That's the fundamental function of learning. We do that by attending to that which is salient and surprising. We're built to be drawn towards surprise. So we can't neglect that. By generating, and we often generate for ourselves manageable surprises, which require us to explore and inquire. So inquiry is intrinsic to the nature of learning. By refining our competence through experimentation and play. Play is often used in opposition to learning, isn't it? Oh, that's just play. I've even been in the occasional secondary school where the ethos is, well, forget everything you've done up to now. That was just play. Now we're going to start serious learning, as if the kind of learning that went on in secondary schools was the be-all and end-all of the nature of learning. Knowledge and competence grow organically. You can't just plant things like e to the pi I equals 1 or minus 1 or square root of 1 or whatever it is in someone's mind, as if it's kind of the soil was virgin soil was sitting there waiting to have new things planted into it. That's the wrong metaphor. Our knowledge and competence grows like a tree. We always grow out from, by addition and adaptation, that which we already know. If it can't be mastered, things that can't be mastered organically in this way, learning is hard. And that's why scientists and mathematicians rely so heavily on metaphor. What they're talking about are things that do not make easy connections with our everyday experience, but we can help them to become embedded through the use of metaphor. The way in which scientists, real scientists, use metaphor, for example, is very powerful. We have to beware of the tendency of metaphors to mislead. But as Samuel Johnson said a long time ago, although metaphor is misleading, it's the least misleading thing we have if we are to boost our own learning. There's a wonderful book, it's disputed, it's contentious, called Where Mathematics Comes From, which is about the embodied origins and the embodied grounding of mathematics in human experience. So we ought to pay attention to that. We ought to know that. So now we come to the values bit. Remember, you can't decide on the best way of teaching. There is no such thing as best practice. We ought to have that tattooed or like written in toothpaste on our bathroom mirrors in the morning. There is no one right way of teaching because it depends on the desired outcomes of education. So we have to involve ourselves in a conversation about values, purposes, and aims. What do we act as if the desired outcomes of education were? Not what we say, not our fine words, but what are embodied in the processes, the practices, the habits, the preferences of schools. Are they there to help kids pass exams, to select a university, to mind children safely while their parents go out to work, to perpetuate privilege? Is it a game that's rigged so that only kids from certain cultures or certain classes in society are predetermined to be winners in that game? To help kids become economically active, little active cogs in a political economic machine, to prepare young people for a productive and fulfilling life. It's like you can't escape these kinds of questions if you want to come out with an answer which says, and so you need to teach like this. The values are really important. What are the desirable outcomes of education? Well, I tend to think of them broadly three different groups. Knowledge. So what knowledge is life-worthy? Life-worthy is a David Perkins word, which I like. What should we be helping kids to know? What should we, all of them, what can we say with our hands on our hearts that almost all kids, the vast majority of kids, will need to know this in order to function well in life? That's a huge conversation. A more recent book of David Perkins is called, oh, I'm going to forget the title of it. Looking at my bookshelves, I can't see it immediately. Future Wise, which is all about the content of the curriculum and the detailed conversations that any intellectual, any intelligent and morally responsible society, the conversations that they should be having about what is it that those kids need to know. Is it ionic and covalent bonding? Is it the nature of anxiety and depression? Is it the function of the brain? Is it ratio and probability? Is it quadratic equations? We should be having these urgent conversations, not trotting on as if education lived in some kind of timeless bubble. What do we want kids to be able to do? Do we want them to be able to knock out small essays and get an A for them? Or do we want them to be highly skilled in what the writer Ernest Hemingway once referred to as crap detection, being highly sensitized to fake news and misinformation? Is that an important outcome of schooling? And if so, what are the implications of that for the way we teach history or the way we teach maths? Are we asking ourselves these questions? What do we want young people to be like? What attitudes and habits? Do we want them to be punctual or do we want them to be imaginative? These aren't exclusive, but these are the kinds of things that we ought to be actively and honestly asking ourselves, not fannying around with simplistic or archaic solutions. The traditional school where privileged knowledge, then something to do with skills, literacies, numeracy and literacy, and then often a bit of lip service towards the development of attitudes, big K, middle-sized S, little a. What would schools be like if we turned those priorities round and said those attitudes are the most important things, which they are, for life satisfaction? There's a load of interesting research which shows if you look at how successful people are in their lives when they're 40 or 50 years old, and how happy they are with their life, it's not their school leaving certificate, it's not their grades that are strong predictors of that. It's personal attributes like resilience, empathy, tolerance for diversity, imaginativeness, and adventurousness. Those are the gold dust that are the residues, the powerful residues of a 21st century education. So cultivation of those attitudes is something we should be thinking about as we teach adding fractions or the Treaty of Waitangi. What attitudes towards learning and knowing are being invited and strengthened by the way we're doing what we're doing in our classrooms? So final, almost at the end. So the conclusion from my reading of the evidence is that didactic teaching is good for relatively short-term retention of relatively superficial knowledge required to be demonstrated on traditional examinations, not exclusively, but especially in science and maths. And that if that's your goal, remember we're still in the realm of values now, if that's your goal, if that's your metric, relatively short-term retention of relatively superficial knowledge, doesn't have to be multiple choice questions, but not deep intricate understandings enough to get you an A on the test. If that's what we're interested in, then didactic teaching is a good pedagogy. But if we have a longer horizon, if that form of testing, if university entrance and what I call the near horizon limits our vision of what we're up to, what we count as success in our schools, then didactic training will do. But if we have a longer term horizon, if we're thinking about their success in life, their success as people, their ability to love, laugh, live, earn money in a way that is honorable and fulfilling and productive and joyous, then that form of teaching may well not be the pedagogy of choice. That's the conclusion that I come down to at the end. So we need to look in the mirror and say, what values are implicit in the pedagogies that we are prescribing or advising? And are they the values that we truly want? And that's not a scientific conversation. That's a moral or philosophical conversation. And that the importance of that conversation cannot be finessed or ignored by simply appealing to a rather shrunken and stereotypical image of the science or sciences of learning. The end.
That was a very comprehensive overview. Thank you, Guy. And you've made the comment. The chat has been going ballistic in the background as people are just reflecting on it. And there are a couple of questions I want to put to you. But one thing that's going through my mind as I've listened to everything that you've said, and I can sort of see it reflected in the conversations going on here. And I'd have to say it's a wee bit like an echo chamber here. You know, you've got a lot of people who are strongly agreeing in principle with what you're saying. But you referenced earlier that we're kind of in this situation here in New Zealand and elsewhere, as we were talking earlier, where there are directives coming that would not seem to fit at all what you're saying. In fact, what you're providing is a very rich and deep kind of counter narrative to some of that. And I guess the question that's going to linger is that when we leave this webinar tonight and then go back into the situation where some of these imperatives are being placed on us, and of course the big bogey sits behind, you know, how we are evaluated, how we are assessed as teachers and as systems. What's your advice to people who are listening to this on what they could do with this information and carry forward these ideas in practical ways?
Stand up and shout as loudly as you can. And I think one of the most important things, which I've not been as successful at as I would have liked to have been, is to do everything we can to promote a conversation about the values of education, the 21st century education, in the public world, beyond the education bubble, beyond the kind of contest between ministry officials and classroom teachers. We need to get parents. I know that there are tens, hundreds, millions of parents every day who wake up and say, I know it doesn't make any sense, sweetheart, but you've just got to suck it up. And they don't know what else to do other than that. And we in the educational profession, hard worked and stressed though we are, need to be trying to recruit as much public conversation, to put it mildly, outrage might be another way of putting it, about about the narrow, shrunken vision of education, which is advantaging a relatively, I was going to say not small, but let's just say some children, and at the same time disadvantaging others. It is unacceptable, I think, and parents ought to stand up and shout about this. They have designed an education system which is a zero-sum game, which means that the winners' winnings have value only because there are a substantial number of losers at that game. In the 21st century, with all the knowledge that we have, that is unacceptable to continue with such a model of education. One of the big unions in the UK has been publishing a lot of interesting think pieces and papers about what they're calling the forgotten third. They estimate somewhere around between 30 and 40% of youngsters come out of schools as the designated losers. And in that fraction, sometimes there are certain cultural backgrounds, certain cultural groups that are way overrepresented. And that is a dereliction of our intelligent thinking about what school should be for. It shouldn't be beyond the wit of man and woman these days to design an education at which everybody could be a winner. And that's my concern. And you can maybe hear in my voice the passion and the sense of urgency that we need to have by recruiting business people, pop singers, the All Blacks,
Yes.
and mums and dads up and down the country to say what is being proposed is a caricature of what our children need.
Think that you're getting a lot of agreement in the chat on that, and I was encouraged to see as you were talking a number of people just responding saying yes, we can do this from our own classrooms. You know, we in New Zealand with the autonomy we have as schools, we could do this. So what you've just said has resonated. I've got a question from Alex. I'm just going to put here that kind of picks up on some of that. I'll go straight to the question. He says, to what extent do you think we might be stuck in a partisan debate here, where there are a few people, perhaps bad faith actors and political agendas, shouting at each other and making some straw man arguments, whereas most of us actually agree with one another? How would you respond to that?
I think there are strong disagreements that need to be called out. But I think that most teachers I know have a much more accurate, dynamic, and nuanced understanding of what goes on in their classrooms than politicians do. Politicians, certainly in my country, often have reached a level of stupidity which leads them to believe that because they went to school once, they know all they need to know about education. And they're full of prejudices and limitations. Just take what I mentioned earlier on about the balance in a classroom between explanation by the teacher and exploration by the students. Now, it's absurd to go to battle for either one of those alone. It's absurd to say, like the Kirshner, Sweller and Clark paper 2006 that gets quoted all over the place, that anything that has even a whiff of exploration in it is to be denigrated, is to be debarred. And that what we want is pure didactic teaching, explanation, 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 repetition, repetition, testing, testing, explanation, explanation, and anything else is a waste of time. That extreme needs to be called out. And likewise, another extreme, which I think was around, certainly in UK schools, a bit too much in the 60s and 70s, was a laissez-faire, do what you want, sweetheart, what do you want to do today? A kind of unstructured, unfocused, unprincipled approach, right. A dereliction, if you like, of adulthood. Now, nobody in their right mind, no teacher that I know, sits in either one or two of those camps. We all sit in the middle. Depending upon the subject, the students that we're working with, the pressures that are on us, we're all in the process of constructing our own dynamic, shifting blend or mix of exploration and explanation. You can't do a good exploration if you don't know what you're doing, obviously. But you can't build resilience, curiosity, and imaginativeness if you're just sat there copying things down and trying to get good marks all day. If we're about something a bit more grown up than that, then we need to live in that kind of hybrid middle ground where teachers are respected enough to know right here, right now, right this moment, what's the right balance of exploration and explanation to work with this material to achieve the objectives that we have. And that's why the teaching profession is a profession and not just a technicianship job.
Yeah, I value what you've said there. There's a lot of agreement with what you're and cheering, I think, because I think in New Zealand we've seen a gradual deprofessionalisation through the demands and insistence on certain things that we're expected to pick up. So I appreciate that comment. One of the thoughts that you just were talking about, and I think you've perhaps already answered, but I'll put it anyway because there are a number of questions that hit on this, and that's the notion of kind of polarization. And thinking back to slide 15 that you had, where you were drawing out, is it just this or is it that? There was quite a bit of
Which was oh, here's
slide
slide 15.
15.
There we go.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah,
As you
yeah,
were talking there were some questions in the back that are repeated in a way in some of the questions here about are we creating a binary conversation in the narrative here, or come back to the language you just used, are we really talking about a hybrid experience where actually, yes, chemical bonding's important, but we need to stretch it. We're not leaving that out. Are we interpreting that right?
yeah, absolutely. And that's why, you have to go and read David Perkins. Perkins' two books. They're so well written. And he's such a living, breathing role model of clear, subtle thinking at the same time. They should be required reading for everybody, particularly all ministers of education around the planet. The first one is about, excuse me, more about the process of learning. But the second one, Future Wise, is a really interesting exploration of what is it that we want kids to know. We're not, nobody is saying get rid of knowledge. You have to have something to work with. You have to have something to work on. You can't just teach resilience in a vacuum. You have to teach resilience through grappling with long division or whatever it might be. So, but we ought to be having this conversation. I mean, the world is knowledge rich that is large numbers of orders of magnitude bigger than we can get into the school curriculum. So why aren't we having that grown-up conversation about, given there's only a certain amount of time that we have and a certain amount of resources that we have, which are the things that matter most in the mid-21st century to our kids? And are some of the veritable truths, some of the things that have been in the curriculum since forever, ought to be fighting hard for their place in the curriculum. They ought to be under pressure to justify themselves. For example, one of Roger Shank's contentions based on evidence, and Perkins is in this too as well, studying mathematics does not improve your ability to think in other contexts. It doesn't. Neither does studying Latin. So we need to be vigilant about, we need to interrogate traditional assumptions and narratives in order to come up with something that is worthy of the name of being a 21st century curriculum. I don't know if that's an answer to your question, Derek, but it's
I think
important.
I think it addresses it really well. I'd like to just draw another question in here that's been referred to a few times, and that is if we could just expand a little bit, drawing on some of the things that you've already talked about how important it is that we affirm knowledge from other social, scientific, and knowledge traditions. Thinking as we do in New Zealand, and the understanding we have Mātauranga Māori, for example, and
Yes,
other cultural perspectives. Would you like to just expand a little bit on that for us?
I would like to understand more about that than I do. I haven't immersed myself, particularly in, I think, a really nice hybrid discipline I'd like to know more about is cognitive anthropology, the way in which people use their minds differently in different cultures. And I think I want to say use their body minds differently, because behind the book that myself and Emily Poole are writing at the moment, about the radical implications of embodiment science is the realization that many traditional and still currently active and vibrant cultures have what it's turning out to be a much closer approximation to a scientifically accurate understanding of the relationship between cognition, emotion, physical behavior, physical structure, health, vitality, strength, physical strength. The literature out there, the burgeoning literature, I mean, it's a really growth area at the moment. I've got a pile of books, I don't know, about 2 feet high, all around embodied cognition and the beginnings of people's understanding about, we need to think hard about a curriculum that was built on the more abstract, the better, the more platonic, the better, and an understanding that the way we think moment to moment, the way our minds grow, is critically influenced by the relationships that we're in, by the physical space that we inhabit, by the posture that we adopt, by whether we're encouraged to, this is a growth area in the research at the moment, by whether children are encouraged to gesture while they're explaining or thinking, or discouraged from gesturing. That difference makes a difference to how smart you appear to be in the classroom.
Yeah.
If you make kids sit on their hands while they're trying to explain some mathematical procedure to you, they look like they're less advanced, they understand things less well than if you allow them to use their hands. All kinds of movement, dance, for example, different kinds of dance, or weight training, or physical exercise, have proven powerful, immediate, important impacts on our creativity, on our decision making, on our problem solving, and on our learning. School barely touches the surface of that. Shut down, sit down, be quiet, sit still, stop fidgeting is the rule of the day. As if the body, as the great Sir Ken Robinson once said, as if the body was just a way of getting your mind to a lesson.
Yes, I think many will identify with that. As you were talking, I was thinking though about some of the imperatives that are happening here, and it seems to me, again, we've got a little bit of the tail wagging the dog thing going on here. That there would be a lot of people in our system, for instance, that would agree totally with you. And for example, Gareth was asking, have you seen the materials, for instance, our own Ministry of Education have been promoting around science of learning, which seem to be very directive towards that more narrow cognitive science slice that you were talking about. And it seems that
Yep.
there's a strong driver driven by things like OECD outcomes and things that show or reveal or make or suggest that our achievement is dropping or declining compared with other countries or compared with previous years. And the logic or the argument is being made that therefore, whilst all these other things are nice to have, we just need to focus on improving the maths and the literacy and the writing, for example.
Well, that's what I talked about, what I call the near horizon.
Yeah,
If your view of education is so blinkered that you consider it to be about doing well in the league table of PISA results, then you need to wake up and smell the coffee. You need to wake up and read the research about what actually makes a difference to kids' lives, to their happiness, to their success, to their drug use, to their stability in their social lives. What are the things that predict those? And you'll find that it's not the things that the PISA tests measure. And that's why I ended up by saying it's up to us. It's up,
correct.
what do we value? What do we as a society in Aotearoa, New Zealand, what do we value? What do we want our kids to be like? What
Yep.
forms of productivity, what forms of happiness? And ministries of education are frightened of moral conversations because they don't know how to control them. They try and turn everything into something technical. And we have to resist that because we can't make progress in the way that we need to if we avoid the moral and ethical conversations. That's my view.
Guy, I think on that point and looking at the time, we might draw to a close. I'm sure this could carry on for a long, long time, looking at the conversation that's going in the background. But for those who are on the call, I would encourage you to subscribe to the AEC Facebook page and continue this conversation in that domain. As Guy said at the beginning, the slides that he has been using, he has provided for us to be able to make available to you. And there were several questions about the books that were being referred to, and they are all embedded in the slides. And Guy, on behalf of everyone on that, I just want to thank you for your generosity in the way that you've shared the deep, deep insights that you've provided here. If there was one takeaway that's lingering in my mind, it was a line that you said, we cannot legitimately draw a straight line between the science of learning to the practice of teaching. And you have more than adequately given substance and explanation to why that's important here. I just want to, on behalf of everybody, say thank you. And again, reinforce for those that we can keep the conversation going in the AEC website. Guy, kia ora koutou.
Thank you very much, Derek. And I would just like to say it doesn't feel like generosity. It feels like self-interest on my part. But I have made such deep and important friendships and contacts, intellectual, personal, and social contacts and relationships in New Zealand that I don't want to see you disappearing down the toilet in education without a lot of hard thinking.
Well, thank you. It means a lot to everyone listening to know that we have your support and the support of others who think like you in this. Appreciated. Good night,
Okay.
everybody.